Well, good afternoon. I'm just came back from Paul Thoreau's panel, and I thought it was just extraordinary to hear Paul tell about his life and travels. And he had mentioned about taking the road, how roads, the open road of Walt Whitman and roads lead to incredible things in life. In amazing experiences and the shared values of living on the road. Well, I was a boy. I grew up in a town called Perrysburg, Ohio. It's near Toledo. And down the road, we used to call it the Township Road, was the most famous person to come from this part of Ohio was the astronaut Neil Armstrong. So this summer, it's going to be 50 years of Neil Armstrong. The Eagle has landed, and that's his famous "One Giant Leap for Mankind" quote when he puts his foot on the moon. I was 9 years old, watching it on TV, and the thought that that guy, the first on the moon, grew up just down the road from me in Wapakoneta, Ohio, was a big deal. So I started collecting kind of Major Matt Mason and moonscapes, and I kind of got into the Apollo program for my generation. And Neil Armstrong was a bit of a Dayglow hero of me when I was young. Lo and behold, I went on to earn my doctorate at Georgetown, and I wrote our first book on Dean Acheson, Harry Truman's Secretary of State. Then I wrote a book called Driven Patriot, The Life and Times of James Forrestal, our Secretary of Navy, first Secretary of Defense, and he committed suicide in the Cold War, hung himself from Bethesda Naval Hospital and died. Forrestal's last words were Nightingale because he had guilt over Operation Nightingale, which was about bringing Nazis into the United States and giving them jobs. After Germany collapsed, the U.S. government started bringing Nazi spies into America. I had Nazi engineers and scientists and all this. And Forrestal, they wouldn't let him see a priest. He was having all these breakdowns, and he wrote about Nightingale and then hung himself, the highest death of a cabinet person, our nation's first Secretary of Defense, Forrestal. Well, I got very precocious. I had two big books of Acheson, Forrestal, and with a bit of temerity, I was able to find Neil Armstrong's post office box. And I wrote him a youthful note that said, "Dear Mr. Armstrong, I grew up down the road from you, and here are my two books. I've signed them to you, and I would love to, I don't have anything in mind, but I'd love to come meet you and come talk to you," and type a letter. I got back, "I will read one of the two books you sent me." I should have only sent him one, not two. And he said, "I'm not doing interviews or anything, but thank you, and I'll keep you in mind down the road." I got blown off by Neil Armstrong. I kind of forgot about it until I got a phone call 8 years later from a man named George Abbey that was head of the Johnson Manned Space Center in Houston. And George calls me up and said, "Well, Neil Armstrong is turning 70 years old, and he's never given us an oral history at NASA." He was a bit of a hermit, Neil Armstrong, not with a capital H. He would do, you can meet him, but he's the exact opposite of Buzz Aldrin. Buzz Aldrin wants to be everywhere and seen everywhere. Neil really went underground, largely not just with the movie First Man you might see here, a book by James Hansen, but he was obsessed with Lindbergh's kidnapping, and after he walked on the moon, would his kids get harassed or kidnapped? And so Armstrong just never made himself available, even to NASA. And he said, "Armstrong says that he'd like you to do the oral history of him." Well, wow, I was stunned. And so I was all excited. I was living in New Orleans and ready to go to Houston. And, everybody had moments when 9/11 hit, when you're watching the planes go in the buildings. Mine was, oh, shit, there goes my Armstrong interview. I was supposed to interview him a couple days, like September 14th. And now 9/11, and all the airports were closed, and I was like, horrible. Obviously, I had more deep thoughts than that. But so I called Abby and I said, can we reschedule? He said, "What do you mean reschedule?" He said, "Neil never cancels anything." And I said, really? And he goes, no. I said, well, Cincinnati Airport, where he lives in his later years, he said, no, he'll fly his own plane in. So lo and behold, quite heroically, I was there at Johnson Space Center waiting to do the interview where Neil flies his plane in. We went and had a box lunch like I just stayed here right now. But beyond that, I got to speak for Armstrong for 7 hours about his entire life. And it's out of that interview. And I have to tell you, what I brought to that interview with Neil Armstrong was me being into the humanities. I thought I'd open him up. Neil Armstrong was an ace pilot in the Korean War, 48 combat missions, never talked about it, known for his reticence and all this. I thought I'd loosen him up and try to talk to him in a more philosophical way about space and the moon. And at one point, we were doing pretty well. He did open up to me a lot about Korea. I was proud because he felt it was his time to talk about it. He was kind of that self-deprecating World War II vet, I'm not a hero kind of thing. But at one juncture, I finally said, well, Mr. Armstrong, don't you ever just go out at night and, just you look at the moon and say, my God, I stood there looking down at Earth. He said, no. He wasn't jerking me around. He wasn't wired like that. And, he was a mission. This was a mission. And the mission was to fill John F. Kennedy's May 25th, 1961 charge that we're going to put a man on the moon by the end of the decade. That's what Jack Kennedy said. And he got hired for the job, and he saw going to the moon as a military mission. So this is my beginnings of thinking, maybe I'll write a book about going to the moon for around the time of the 50th anniversary, spurred not just by my Neil Armstrong experience, but I'm a professor at Rice University in Houston. George Abbey, who I mentioned, is a colleague of mine. I have access to NASA. And also John F. Kennedy came to my university, Rice, and gave his famous speech in front of a football stadium full of people. He said, we choose to go to the moon because it's hard. We choose to go because it's difficult, and gave this extraordinary speech. If you want to see great presidential oration moving people, look at John F. Kennedy's September 12th, 1962 at Rice University. So I was off to the races to do a book called American Moonshot, John F. Kennedy and the Great Space Race. Well, what happened when I started it is there's a lot of books about John F. Kennedy. And I started digging into them. But when I found out that the real story was about the Nazis that came to the United States under a thing called Operation Paperclip, let me tell you what happens. John F. Kennedy is born in 1917. He's a child of aviation, born, as you all know, into a wealthy family. The Wright brothers are 1903. We have aviation. Charles Lindbergh's 1927 when John F. Kennedy's 10. But the big book that kids used to read was Jules Verne's story of going to the moon. And what people don't realize about Jules Verne's book, he's writing after the Civil War. All right? Right after American Civil War, the Frenchman Jules Verne says in his moon novel that the space rocket will leave from Florida. It will carry 3 astronauts, and 2 will go to the moon, and they'll splash down in the ocean. He was prescient, Jules Verne. And Verne was a hero of Jack Kennedy, a utter hero of Neil Armstrong, and a even bigger hero for Wernher von Braun. Some of you last night may have been in the panel I was on with Tom Hanks, and Hanks wrote a short piece in his book I saw about Alan Beam, one of the Apollo 12 astronauts to the moon. And Hanks envisioned 4 kids today cobbling a rocket together that lands on the moon. They work for Home Depot, and they create it in their backyard, and they call it the Alan Beam. Funny little vignette. What's interesting is that's what rocketry was like when Jack Kennedy grew up. The first American rocket to go off was shot out of a cabbage field in Auburn, Massachusetts in 1925 and 26 by a professor at Clark University named Robert Goddard. and you might hear Goddard Space Center, and you hear his name. He was our rocketeer. He was the first one. They would arrest him for noise making of blasting that rocket out in the fields, and people thought it was a plane crashing. Early aviation, it's just wreckage of planes going down all the time. And so they then made a move to a military base, and Goddard was angry in Massachusetts, where officials were writing him up. I once wrote about how Henry Ford got written up with his first car for noise making and scaring all the horses. And so he applied, and Henry Ford got the world's first driver's license. Well, Goddard was trying to get a license to shoot these rockets up, but they weren't going into space, but they were the best rockets America could produce. He got the hell out of Massachusetts and goes to Roswell, New Mexico. And you wonder where all these alien stories about Roswell, New Mexico come from. Goddard moved out there. He had a ranch, Eden Valley, and he'd fire stuff up in the air, and locals would spot it, and reports came, and a lore has grown out after his rockets. So Goddard was our rocketer. But the big one was Werner von Braun. Now, you're supposed to say it phonetically correct. I don't speak German, von Braun. But I'm going to be Midwest and say Werner von Braun because it's easier for me. Von Braun is born same time as Jack Kennedy. And he comes from a deeply aristocratic family also. Kennedy's rich, well-heeled, as you all know. Von Braun's from one of the wealthier German families. But Werner von Braun was a genius rocketeer early. He got arrested for putting in Berlin a wagon with his homemade rockets that started scaring all the animals, and they hit buildings and all, and the police took him in because his dad was so wealthy and famous. He wasn't punished for it. He ended up going to the Technical University in Berlin, and by the time he's 18 years old, he's considered a genius, Werner von Braun. He's handsome, broad shoulders, great athlete. His whole life he would hunt, swim, even do scuba diving. But more to the point, he got noticed quickly by the Nazis. He was doing Weimar Republic rockets experiments, but by 1933, Hitler comes in, and the German rocketeers that were really opposed to the fascists left. There's stories of them that if you could, you got out. But von Braun thought all Werner von Braun was a genius at funding too, that rocketry cost a lot of money, and if the military of Germany will pay for my rocket experiments, and he wanted to go to the moon. He thought that in his lifetime, his objective from age 18 onwards was Werner von Braun. I'm going to lead us into space. We're going to go to the moon. You have to go above 62 miles, and then, to get into space. Nobody had ever done it before. So in the 30s, he's just a quiet German rocketeer in many ways, but they're starting to develop an idea that they can build a super weapon in Nazi Germany. And by the time of World War II, Werner von Braun gets moved with his team of rocket specialists into the Baltic part of Germany, and they start the most expensive camp on rocketry, not rockets to go to the moon, but rockets to destroy London and maybe even New York. We did atomic bombs in the United States, as you all know, the Manhattan Project. But we weren't doing anything with rocketry. Goddard couldn't even get a contract. They had him go to Annapolis to do a little bit, but we put it all on atomic weapons. Well, the Germans were putting it into this massive rocketry program. And von Braun now just starts doing regular attempts to build rockets that can break the barriers of the shackles of Earth to go into space. And his big successes in 1943. And then by 1944, he sends the first rocket into space ever. The problem is, in order to build these rockets, and guys, to build these giant rockets into space, these were secret compounds. The British Air Force was trying to target it. They would do artificial fog over it. This is one of the Third Reich's top secret programs, the secret weapon that would win the war, and Werner von Braun was the one doing it. He would later, after the war, try to, like all German, I had nothing to do. I'm just doing my job. I'm a young man. I'm a rocketeer. I was doing it for science, Well, what he doesn't say in his apologies is that they found the ugliest, the Dora Jewish work camps that were forced to die building his rockets was the most heinous, hideous stories you'll ever want to see. It was a sub camp of Buchenwald, and because to build these programs, you had to go at a 24/7 basement, often working in caves. So he's a deeply compromised person just from the idea of using slave labor to build his rockets, Wernher von Braun. But lo and behold, he creates first the V-1 bomb and then the famous V-2. I saw in my thing, they have the word screaming. You know, the great novelist Thomas Pynchon's written Gravity's Rainbow and V, and he's dealt a lot with the V-2s. Anybody in London knows the bombs did hit London. What the V-2, the V-1 rocket were doodle bugs, they were buzz bombs. The thing about V-1 rockets hitting London, Antwerp, and elsewhere, Nazi bombs, you could hear them. It'd go in the sky, so you'd hear the missile coming, bomb, and you could maybe guard yourself. The V-2 is silent. It would come and it just blows up an entire block. And the thing that what we miscalculated with our intelligence of German rocketry was that they built it mobile, that you can move it to different places. They only had an arc of 100 or 210 miles. So what the Germans did was along France, occupied France and Holland and Belgium, they would move in these rocket launchers, which you could imagine were giant devices, and then lob the rockets into London. And 5,000 people in London killed. But a lot of these rockets were duds. They didn't blow up. They were rushing it too much. It had problems with it. But the U.S. government, the one last fear of Adolf Hitler were these V-2s get mass-produced more. The idea was to blow up London. It's a different lecture, guys, but Hitler also wanted to destroy America, Boston, New York, with the bomb project, too. But at any rate, I write about Werner von Braun. There's a novel, The Bridge Over River Kwai, where the engineers they get so obsessed of the engineering project, they don't think about humanity. It's just like to get the bridge built. This was to get the perfect rocket made. And one of the bases for V-1s, V-2s, and V-3s was in southern France. And we decided that we were going to have to take it out. The British were wreaking havoc in Germany with bombing, but we created a secret mission called Aphrodite, in which we asked our pilots, the best pilots we have, who wanted to volunteer to be the one to fly over the English Channel. And what we did, since we didn't have missiles, we took Liberator planes, B-24s and the like, and we packed them with Torpex dynamite, more powerful than TNT, filled the airplane, filled with explosive, put a detonator on it. We would send two pilots together. They'd fly the plane over the English Channel, and then it was going to go down like a drone. It's almost like kamikaze stuff. They would be drone pilots pointing the explosives at where we thought these V-1, V-2s were being manufactured. And then the pilots last second would parachute out and then have to find their way to safety. Guess who signed up for the first one of these dangerous missions? Joe Kennedy, the brother of John F. Kennedy. Joe Kennedy could have come home. He had already earned it, but his brother, at the same time this was going on, Jack Kennedy became the PT-109 hero in the Solomon Islands. John Hershey, the great New Yorker writer, wrote a kind of a puff piece on Kennedy, but about his heroism in the South Pacific in the PT-109 incident, which was heroic of Kennedy. But due to his father, Jack Kennedy's dad would buy Reader's Digest things, and he got his son John F. Kennedy everywhere. So now his other brother, the older one that young Jack looked up to, decided, I'm going to go on a high-risk mission too. Give the Kennedys credit for not being afraid of risk. Books are called about them, about risk. And they, one of them by Nigel Hamilton called Reckless Youth about John F. Kennedy. Any rate, he went in that, flew over, and they vaporized. There was a malfunction, and Kennedy, his hero, his older brother died, Jack Kennedy, trying to take out these missiles, Nazi missiles. Jack Kennedy went to with Hyannis, and they all, they were mourning his brother's death. Old Joe Kennedy, the father, was broken, but Jack kept partying. One night, it always stuck in me that Jack Kennedy they were doing with his friend called Barney. They were doing these crazy Broadway songs out in Hyannisport House in Cape Cod, and suddenly old Joe Kennedy, the father says, "Jack, for God's sake, have respect for your dead brother. Quit laughing." It was like everybody left the party. But so Jack Kennedy got over his brother's death in some ways, but the father really never did. But after the war, John F. Kennedy's now everything. The father, who's people call him a patriarch, dictatorial. He was a damn good father, Joe Kennedy. However, he would just drove his kids. You're going to be successful. We're going to prove that Catholics are great, And so Jack, in 1945, said, "I want to be a journalist." He worked for the Hearst newspapers. He actually covered as a journalist the Potsdam Conference with Churchill and Stalin and Truman. He went to the United Nations founding on Nob Hill at the Fairmont Hotel where the UN San Francisco Charter was, doing journalism pieces. But he decided, Jack Kennedy, in 1946 to run to Congress. He runs for Massachusetts and wins. He knows nothing really about politics. One of the beautiful things about John F. Kennedy is he never dumbed down speeches. No populism. He would quote Cicero, and he's at working class audiences and would do that highfalutin language and dress, and people accepted that's where he was. You don't always have to talk down or be phony. He was by nature erudite and funny and apropos almost for every moment, young Jack. So in 46, he won Congress. He wins again in 48 Congress. By 1952, he wins for the U.S. Senate. John F. Kennedy never lost an election in his entire life because John F. Kennedy wasn't a liberal. He wasn't a conservative. He wasn't right. He wasn't left. He was about winning. And there's I give you one of 100 stories of John F. Kennedy when he would play chess and he could see that he was getting beat. He would knock the pieces off and say, "I guess we'll never know who won." Okay, I tell you that's how he's wired, okay, his way of thinking. And when you want to study him, you study pragmatism, really, more than any ideological currents in politics. But by that time, he's 46, 48, and wins 52. That's Jack Kennedy. Young, hotshot star like Beto O'Rourke in the Democratic Party of the early Cold War years. Werner von Braun, at that 1945, he's recognizing the Germans are falling, and he does something extraordinary. Von Braun forges documents, tells his top rocket scientist, he gets like the 137 of the key technicians, and says, Hitler is done. We're going to go turn ourselves into the Americans. We have all of the blueprints of missile technology. We've got it all. It's the most valuable booty of the war. So von Braun gets a train, uses fake documents, moves a train, and gets all of these men to bury all of the blueprints and missile parts, the key stuff, and they blow up a shaft of a mine to cover it all up. Then he takes the train and they hide out in the Bavarian mountains. And von Braun sends his little brother Magnus on a bicycle to say, "Go find an American soldier and tell him we've got the V-2. We've got all of the thing that's been havocing Britain. We got all of it. We got Wernher von Braun." Our intelligence people knew who von Braun was. He's the number one man we wanted to get was von Braun, because if he fell in Soviet hands, it was going to be a problem for us. And Magnus, the brother, bicycled for a while, and suddenly he drove right into American troops who were moving their way into Germany. And a guy from Sheboygan, Wisconsin, pointed a gun at him. He said, no, my brother is Wernher von Braun. And the soldier said, "Yeah, right, sure." Didn't believe him. They captured him, and eventually they found out it was all true. And a guy named General Tolstoy went and met von Braun, and he said, "I give you everything, tell you everything. Let us move to America. I want my Rocketeers and their families to come, and I will work for the United States. I've hit everything. I know where it is." And it became controversial, and Truman decided, let's do it. And so all of these German Rocketeers and all of their V-2 parts and blueprints get captured by the United States. Nothing made Stalin angrier right after, in the June of 45, then, God damn it, we've marched all the way into Germany, and the Americans sneak away with the war booty of von Braun and his parts. We moved Werner von Braun to Fort Bliss, El Paso, Texas. 137 Nazis there. We don't forge their documents, but we find ways to not accuse them of war crimes, which we easily could have and perhaps should have, although it's a longer conversation of what is a war crime, meaning they were protected from the Nuremberg thing, and they now were embedded with our U.S. Army, and they were under house arrest. They couldn't go anywhere, but he married a young German woman, and they have a family there at the base, and they were surrounded, a very limited life. The U.S. called them prisoners of peace, not prisoners of war in the 1940s. But von Braun is starting now to talk about going to the moon. He writes a novel about going to Mars, and we're not that interested in the moon. What we're interested in 47, 48, 49 are intercontinental ballistic missiles that you can fire. Von Braun is the great inventor genius of the ICBMs, our missiles of today. And he's using Roswell, New Mexico, Fort Bliss, White Sands Proving Ground, testing them out there. But he's always carping, I'm not getting enough funding, nobody's paying attention to it. We now take those Germans, and he did some public things. He spoke at the El Paso Rotary Club once, but he very shrewdly, von Braun, would always talk about the moon. Oh, I was stuck in World War II with my militarized rocket. I'm a moon person. We're going to go to the moon, space travel. And they then move them from Fort Bliss to Huntsville, Alabama, which today you might know is called Rocket City, USA. Army running Huntsville. They moved all the Germans there in Huntsville. They were happier in Alabama. It had dark forest and the things a little more there than the desert. And what von Braun does is interestingly enough, Dwight Eisenhower does not like Wernher von Braun, even though he's in the Army. He thinks he's a Nazi. He was. And Ike had to endure seeing concentration camps. And at the Dora camp where von Braun worked, when we got in there, just bodies of prisoners that were left like piles of cordwood of not just Jewish slaves, but Slavs and others, but horrific Holocaust scenes that Ike saw. Eisenhower quite presently said, film all of it. Eisenhower made Germans come march through the camp to see what they did, and he filmed it all. If you go to the Holocaust Museum in D.C., it's all, Dwight Eisenhower made the Army take film. Now, the idea that his beloved U.S. Army is filled with 137 Nazis who tried to destroy London, wreak havoc, would have killed every American they could have, did not appeal to Ike. You know who didn't mind? Jack Kennedy. Kennedy thought that World War II, by 1953, John F. Kennedy and von Braun are chosen to be the judges for Time Man of the Year. Kennedy just won the Senator. He was a hotshot. Henry Luce, the great leader of Time magazine, he was close friends with old Joe Kennedy. In fact, when he wrote his first book, Jack Kennedy, Why England Slept, the intro was by Henry Luce. Now Luce picked the young Kennedy to be a judge, and the other judge was Wernher von Braun to pick the Time Man of the Year for 1953. Come to New York, do a 1-hour TV show together. They went out on the town. They got along famously. Both of them were great womanizers, von Braun and Jack Kennedy. They both women were deeply attracted to them too. And they got along because Kennedy said we were just grunts in World War II. What was von Braun supposed to do? He was German. He had to serve. I had to go to the damn Pacific. It was World War II that we were the young guys. And that's over. I don't hold any grudges against Germans or anybody. And he said Eisenhower is a 19th century man. Eisenhower was born in the 19th century. Khrushchev's born in the 19th century. Charles de Gaulle's born in the 19th century. We're jet age guys. You know, they're like the debonair twins. They would dress the same, almost, Kennedy and von Braun. And so they created a friendship, von Braun and Kennedy. Now, then in the 1950s, von Braun is a genius at publicity. He became one of the closest friends of Walt Disney. Disney would put him on TV for a Rocketry of Tomorrow. In Tomorrowland at Disneyland, here's Werner von Braun to tell us we'll go to the moon someday. And so Disney and von Braun formed up a thing. Walter Cronkite fell in deep for Werner von Braun with, he's going to get us to the moon someday. And now he's won over Jack Kennedy, von Braun. And in 1957, Sputnik. The Soviets put a satellite into space. Von Braun had been telling everybody, I got a rocket that could put a satellite up. I could put a communication satellite up. I could do it right now. Eisenhower wouldn't let him. Ike made the Navy do it because they weren't Nazis in the Navy. He had the Vanguard rocket program. And you know what happened to the first Vanguard rockets? They all blew up on the pad at Cape Canaveral. So Eisenhower, the Army guy, had picked Navy, and they didn't take off the rockets. And so by 57, Sputnik creates quite a panic. Not only did, you got to put it in chronology-wise, the big year being 1949, when Truman's president, Truman finds out the Soviets have exploded a nuclear bomb. We were the only time in world history one power had nuclear weapons, U.S., 1945 to 49. Now the Soviets got the bomb. The Soviets have the hydrogen bomb. China in 1949 turns communist with Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai taking over China. Now it's early 50, McCarthyism's going on in America, that we sold the secrets to the Russians and, you know, and the Rosenbergs and all of it. How are the Soviets doing so well? And now they just are killing us, seemingly killing us in rocketry and satellites. And Kennedy sees a political opening. It's Eisenhower who's created a missile gap, that we're losing to the Soviets. We're losing because Ike's not doing anything. And Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson start pummeling on Eisenhower for not doing enough, and Stuart Symington, senator from Missouri, and Scoop Jackson from the state of Washington. In other words, 57, Sputnik's late 57, it's 58. 58's a midterm election year. Kennedy gets reelected to the U.S. Senate in 58, and he's aiming to run for president in 1960. He's looking for an issue. He goes hawk that Kennedy's weak against the Soviets, and I'll be rougher on missiles. We'll build more. We'll be the first in everything. We'll beat them. We will be the superpower, right? And the big moment comes, though, when Lyndon Johnson guy starts deciding, well, I'm going to split the difference, and I won't criticize Eisenhower by name, but I'll criticize him. And he got the gig. Eisenhower let Senator Lyndon B. Johnson push through Space Act legislation, and Eisenhower signs it. And in 1958, Dwight Eisenhower creates NASA, and it's a direct result of Sputnik, and Lyndon takes the congressional credit for it. Jack's just out there carping around a lot, about it. But it's a big deal like 58. Can we beat the Russians? Are we losing? In 1960, John F. Kennedy runs, and he creates his slogan, the New Frontier. The New Frontier, FDR has the New Deal, and Truman had the Fair Deal. The New Frontier was about whatever you wanted it to be. It didn't really have a meaning, except it was about space age, technology, winning. That space was the new frontier. The original language I found in my research of the term new frontier is all in NASA literature of 58, 59. It's going to be a new frontier. Kennedy grabs onto it. And in the 1960, when he runs for president, he is constantly hammering Nixon on, you guys have lost. If I'm president, I'm worried there's going to be a Soviet flag on the moon, and I want to see an American flag. He said that in one of his 4 presidential debates. The exact phrase, if we were like Nixon, you'll get a Soviet flag on the moon. You're like me, you get an American flag. And they're pushing this new tech things. Guys, in 1960, when Kennedy's running, do you realize no universities had what you would call computer science classes? Today, they call them IT classes or whatever. And by 63, They're at every university's doing computer because the transistor microchips being discovered in the late 50s too. And this combo of technology and Kennedy and the space race gives him some momentum. He wins in 1960, Jack Kennedy. And he's debating the big issue from 58 to 1961 is, can we do manned space? Should we put a human in space? Some people, the Russians put a dog, but their dog went into space and they had no way to bring the dog back. Okay, he died. He's floating around out there, Laika somewhere, where U.S. was saying if we bring a creature up, we got to put a creature back down. So, and then apes, chimpanzees, one Ham and Enos, we sent ships up into space, Von Braun rockets. That wasn't humans. And so Jack Kennedy no sooner gives his famous inaugural, signed in, has the Bay of Pigs disaster, the invasion of Cuba, and then Yuri Gagarin in April 61 is the first person human in space. The Russians beat us with Gagarin in space, and it's on Kennedy's watch. He can't blame Ike anymore. He's president. And so Gagarin's a big deal, rightfully so. I mean, it was a great space feat by the Russians. They, however, had no way to bring back down the capsule. We had to do the parachute and the capsule lands. The Gagarin's would go, it was a ball, and when it come down, you would have to parachute out, and then the ball would crash to the land. And so at the end of Gagarin's journey, he's really in a parachute. Different space programs, technology. So Kennedy's in a bind. I'm getting whooped now with Gagarin, manned space, Bay of Pigs fiasco. And he turns to Werner Von Braun, his friend, Lyndon Johnson, and says, guys, give me a space program where we win. And one transfer, I've been listening to these Kennedy tapes that have, in fact, some of the tapes nobody's heard before my book comes out, first time I'll ever be out there. But Kennedy's telling these guys, at one point he blows up and says, I don't care if it's the janitor over there. I want to know how we can leapfrog the Soviets. Kennedy wants to he thought our space program was going like science should, experiment incrementally. Kennedy, I found a letter he wrote to a kid on the campaign trail in 58 from Princeton, and Kennedy scrawls it. He was in Wisconsin and uses the word leapfrog for the first time. Well, we're going to have to leapfrog the Soviets. Kennedy's saying, what's the leapfrog? Von Braun. Jack, the moon. I can get us to the moon. I know how to do it. Nobody believes me. Kennedy believed him because Kennedy was a reader of magazines, and Von Braun was on all the covers. He was on Time magazine cover, Collier's. I told you this whole Disney thing. So for Kennedy, a little like here Donald Trump says, I listen to the TV generals. Jack Kennedy, Von Braun must be the one. He's on every damn magazine. He must be the one. I don't want to hear about these other incremental guys. That's the guy that can do it. And so by May 25th, Jack Kennedy, they call it his second inaugural. He goes to a joint session of Congress and gives a speech where he says, we're going to put the man by the moon at the end of the decade. Every single person in the audience, they got like kind of tepid. He left from saying we're going to go to the moon in the car with Ted Sorensen, the speechwriter. He said, I bombed. I thought it was going to be thunderous. I bombed. He had a good sense of an audience, Jack Kennedy. And they worried about it. And then next day, Washington Post was all positive. It started becoming positive. And it became a joint issue by 61 because in between Gagarin and going to the moon, we put an astronaut in space. Alan Shepard of New Hampshire. Shepard's great-great-great-great-great-grandfather was on the Mayflower. Shepard went up, and it showed we could do manned space. And now Kennedy, the ratings on TV were amazing, and Jack Kennedy says, this is the new frontier. Astronauts, space, American exceptionalism. We're number one in technology. And so from May of 61, on the strength of Alan Shepard's first Mercury mission, we start putting astronauts into space, and everybody watches, must-be-watched television. Kennedy's starting to become a diehard fan. He visits Werner Von Braun regularly at Huntsville, Alabama. Everybody doesn't like Werner Von Braun in the Kennedy administration for this one reason. Whenever Kennedy would go to Huntsville or Cape Canaveral, he'd tell Von Braun to come fly with him to his next stop on Air Force One. Here are all the cabinet people getting blown off, and he'd grab the Rocketeer, and they chat about everything. And but big one is by February of 62, John Glenn, as you know, goes up and does the orbiting of the Earth. He becomes our biggest hero since Charles Lindbergh. Kennedy realizes Glenn's the new American hero, nothing like him. Most of these astronauts were Republicans, and Glenn said, I'm an independent, and Kennedy said, no, you're not, you're a Kennedy Democrat. And Bobby Kennedy adopted John Glenn. I just spoke a week ago to Ethel Kennedy, Bobby Kennedy's wife, who was telling me when they flew out here to Palm Springs, they went driving around with John Glenn and Andy Williams singing Moon River out here after they, because everything was space, guys. But look, now what happens beyond the John Glenn in 62? Lyndon Johnson is saying it's going to come. Where's the money going? And here, guys, is the key. Here's what Jack Kennedy starts also worrying about. A political animal, Kennedy. 64, I'm going to lose. It was Barry Goldwater, but he was worried he'd lose in 64 because in 60, the South was Democratic. Remember, the South was the old Democrats. This was pre-Lyndon Johnson Civil Rights Acts. Now, civil rights everywhere. Kennedy's Justice Department at Ole Miss with James Meredith integration, and Kennedy's recognized that I'm going to lose the South and I'm not going to get reelected. So he cuts a deal and says, how about we put billions of dollars into space into the southern zone? We'll flood you with new technology money. And the head of the Senate Space Appropriations is Senator Walter Kerr of Oklahoma. Albert Thomas of Houston is the head of the congressional spending. Lyndon goes to the old Southern, the guys like Richard Russell. We'll pour, how about $150 million in, your state? I'll get $200 million and more in Alabama. If you look at where NASA's head hubs are, it's Texas getting the money, Alabama, Mississippi, Florida, Virginia. As an insurance policy to say, shut up about civil rights, don't beat up on my Justice Department, and I'm going to pump a lot of pork into your state. And it's a strategy, and it starts taking hold. So Lyndon gets the Manned Space Center to Houston with Albert Thomas. Everybody bid on it. It was like the Amazon bid for the second campus last year, every city putting in their proposal. It was a cooked deal. It was going down to Texas, to Houston. And hence, Houston suddenly becomes Space City, USA. They create, in 1962, the Astros baseball team. The NBA team is the Rockets. They originally were in San Diego, but they moved there to promote Rockets. I looked at a Yellow Pages in Houston, 1962. Space Burger, drive-through. Apollo, Astro Gal dry cleaner. Everything became space, and including architecture all over America, space age architecture and TV, the Jetsons, and Lost in Space, and later Star Trek. But it's space craze going on under Jack Kennedy in 62. Go to Seattle, you see the Emerald Tower there in Seattle. That was from the World's Fair in 62, and the big host there in Seattle was Space Needle. And at the Space Needle in Seattle, John Glenn was the big star there. Glenn's little Friendship 7 capsule went all over the world. People would queue up for 5 hours just to peer in the little capsule. We saw it as promoting what Kennedy thought global prestige for the United States. We were beating the Soviets into space. Now, funding NASA we talk about the moonshot. The actual term moonshot became popular out here in California in 59 from a baseball player, Wally Moon, who played for the Dodgers. And he'd hit these towering home runs, which were known as moonshots. And Vince Scully would do it on radio. That's a moonshot, over the fence. And then it got applied to space. So I looked at old Houston Press newspapers, and you start seeing the term moonshot, using it all the time. We now use the term moonshot for everything. What's our next moonshot? Cure cancer, climate change moonshot, because the term moonshot now means American can-doism. The part that was weird about Kennedy was saying by the end of the decade, most politicians don't do it. meaning by 69 we'd have to go on the moon. But we're getting the funding, and Kennedy gives these incredible speeches, and the money goes into NASA. We start going, all systems go. We bring in here in California, a big part of it, in places like Pasadena's Jet Propulsion Laboratory, on and on. We end Mercury project. Mercury's 1 astronaut in space. Gemini is 2. And the big ones, Project Apollo, which is the 3. They create the Von Braun Saturn rockets, the rocket that takes us to the moon, which will be 50 years this summer. Wernher von Braun Saturn V rocket. He designed it, but it gets assembled in Louisiana. It gets shipped to Florida with parts from California, and it's kind of this new deal of technology at Kennedy's. But as you all know, Jack Kennedy gets shot in Dallas. Now, I should tell you, the days leading up to Kennedy's death in Dallas, he was on a space tour of the South. That's what he was doing in Texas. He first had gone to Cape Canaveral, and he had been to Alabama. He showed up in San Antonio and gave a great speech about space medicine, because Brooks Air Force Base in San Antonio was now pioneering in space medicine. All of these medical things, like from pacemakers to stents to dialysis machines, the technology that was coming out through NASA is astounding. In also GPS systems, new types of computer systems, extraordinary benefits of all of this. Kennedy gives a pro-space speech in San Antonio. He then goes to Houston and gives a speech to honor Albert Thomas, who brought the Space Center to Houston, and accidentally says, "I've given Albert Thomas the greatest payday ever." And he said, "I mean payload." Payload is when you go up, but everybody laughed because, yeah, you put a lot of money into Houston. And so when Kennedy was in Houston, he was treated, Republicans said treat him well, San Antonio well. Dallas never got any space money. There's nothing with the space industry in Dallas. They were very hostile to him up there. So Kennedy decided in San Antonio, he told the astronaut, Gordon Cooper, "Gordon, you got to come with me to Dallas. We'll do an open convertible, and I need a space hero by my side in Dallas." Cooper was supposed to go with them, and it got canceled last minute. He was canceled not to go, that he had to report to this government meeting. And so Kennedy had no space hero with them like he was supposed to. When he drove to the Trade Mart in Dallas, when he was shot at the museum, you could go there now, 6th floor museum, he was going to the Trade Mart to give a speech about space and about we're going to go to the moon. But he made many people angry weeks before his death, Kennedy, because he went to the UN and said, let's do joint space, Russia and the United States going to the moon. Why don't we pull together? Well, people in our government went nuts. There's even a column in the Washington Post by a famous columnist that said CIA is really angry at Kennedy of these proposals of U.S. because the Cuban Missile Crisis so jarred Jack Kennedy. He started worrying about how much time do I have, John? Well, I'm almost done. I have my guy dead here. So Kennedy's gone, guys. After his death, and Von Braun continues to push it forward. And I found a correspondence with Jackie Kennedy, who writes them, and it's a love letter that Jackie writes Wernher von Braun. It says, "Do it for Jack." He puts JFK von Braun on the rocket. And in 1969, when Neil Armstrong goes on the moon, at NASA, all their headquarters, they put "task accomplished," quoted Jack Kennedy's line. And at Arlington Cemetery, somebody put a note on Kennedy's grave, "Mr. President, the eagle has landed." That the dream of Jack Kennedy of the moon and this weird collaboration he had with Wernher von Braun had come to fruition. Thank you, guys.